Could we just take this as Beijing's usual measured response, or is there something else here?
Well, it largely comes down to a lack of trust. I mean, of course, the US don't trust the Chinese to implement the deal, and that's been a big part of the reason why they've pushed for an enforcement mechanism. That isn't there, of course, in this phase one deal. And of course, on the Chinese side, they have significant lack of trust when it comes to whether or not President Trump will actually hold up his side of the agreement. And they were whiplashed by previous deals, quote unquote, that they thought they'd secured with Trump, only for him to turn around and slap tariffs on, or to send a tweet that underwrote or at least took apart the negotiated compromise that they come to. So they feel like they've been burnt in the past. So that is part of it. And what we're hearing, of course, is that they want to iron out the details before potentially handing this over for President Xi to sign alongside President Trump, maybe at the APEC summit in November. The other thing that our sources are saying is that the Chinese want a commitment from the US that they won't impose additional tariffs come December the 15th. Those are currently on the pipeline, of course. So they want to ensure that additional tariffs aren't coming down from the US come December the 15th. But yes, part of it is a lack of trust. And you're seeing that reflected in the way that state media are reporting on this. They've not called it a deal. They've said that there's been substantial progress, but they've been pretty cautious in the way that they frame this. And of course, all of this is leading to many suspecting that this deal, the phase one deal and the second and third parts of this are going to be very difficult to achieve, to nail down, to get to a point where you have a final deal. So you've got the likes of Citigroup who said, look, a final agreement between the US and China is still unlikely before 2020. By the way, if you want to get a sense of how committed China is to the phase one part of this agreement, you should look at the yuan. That's according to Capital Economics, at least. You see the fixing has essentially been around 7.07 for the last few weeks. Very little movement in terms of the fixing for the currency. It has, of course, strengthened offshore and onshore just in the last couple of days on the back of this agreement. But there is a sense that if China is really committed to upholding a stronger currency, then you see that reflected in a stronger fix. We didn't get that on Monday. We may get that today, 9:15. So that's something to watch out for as well.
And Tom, how does the situation in Hong Kong also weigh into these negotiations?
Well, it seems that in the last few days, President Trump has wanted to sideline the Hong Kong issue to some extent, which of course would please Beijing. But the reality is that things are moving forward of their own momentum. You do have the protests, the unrest, of course, continuing in the city. And from the domestic US political side, you see that there is a bipartisan push now to sign off on the Hong Kong human rights and democracy legislation there that would lead to potentially an annual check on the special status that Hong Kong has. And you have Republicans like Ted Cruz, by the way, who've been over in Hong Kong to show their support for the protesters. So it seems like Trump wants to keep it as a separate issue, but the momentum may just mean that it is forced into these negotiations further down the line. And that is just another factor that has to be weighed in to the negotiations between the two sides, alongside questions about human rights, national security, technology, of course. So it just makes the negotiations potentially that much more complex.